Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope you're all Nova and that everybody is having a preem week. So, it was recently brought to my attention by one of my fellow hair loss witchers that there is a podcast by a carnivore promoting doctor who is ironically named Paul Saladino. You know, that would be like if Vegan Gain's real name were Richard Burgers. But anyways, in the podcast, Dr. Saladino has a discussion with our good friend Rob English, who is a medical editor who discusses hair loss, but is also a proponent of the Blüdflow theory. So, I only know about Paul Saladino because, like most carnivore diet promoters, he enjoys trolling vegans on social media, but I haven't actually looked at exactly what he does, so I went to his website, carnivoremd.com, and it looks like he's one of those doctors who decided the supplement industry pays better than practicing medicine, so now he sells supplements that have a bunch of meaningless buzzwords that appeal to bone broth and butter coffee slurping mommy bloggers like grass-fed or organic, and he also sells a supplement targeted towards men that will allegedly improve our virility because it has bull testicles in it, because, you know, that's how health obviously works, right? I mean, if you want to improve the function of an organ, you just eat the organ from another creature. So, for instance, if I want to improve my vision, I can just eat some eyeballs from a cow, right? So, the supplement seems pretty pricey considering they're just made out of organ meats, which are usually just a byproduct of the meat industry, since demand for organ meat isn't high enough for animals to be raised specifically for that purpose. But if the supplement industry can take the main ingredient in a children's junk food product like bone broth and market it as a miraculous health elixir that can practically make us immortal and regenerate limbs, then you damn well better believe that they can convince impressionable idiots that masticating on a bull's genitals will make you more virile. Now, I don't really give a shit about any of these supplements he's selling. I mean, I doubt they work, but it's not like he's the only person on the internet to sell supplements with outlandish health claims not backed by clinical evidence. However, one particular supplement did catch my eye, which is called Skin, Hair, and Nails, and the idea behind this podcast suddenly made sense to me after seeing this. Rob English is, after all, a medical editor who has written peer-reviewed research on hair loss, so it makes sense that Dr. Saladino would bring him on his show in order to promote ideas which legitimize his supplement, which is basically just a combination of various animal ingredients like liver, bone marrow, and cartilage. Now, it's important to note that none of these ingredients in this supplement have any clinical evidence of being effective for fighting angiogenic alopecia. They're basically just food in a pill sold at about $50 per bottle. So undoubtedly, Dr. Saladino would like to have his product validated by someone who seems like he knows what he's talking about. That's why in those late night infomercials where they sell penis enlargement pills, they'll always have a doctor on it who claims to use it personally, or he'll cite some obscure scientific study that most people will not be able to interpret because they're scientifically illiterate. So anyways, I watched the whole video so you don't have to, because it is a very long video, over 2 hours long in fact, and the two gentlemen basically spend the majority of the time just gushing over each other. So we'll just go through some of the highlights as well as some of the lowlights and hopefully make the video more digestible and palatable than the carnivore diet. So let's dive balls deep and see what these two carnivore enthusiasts have to say about meat and hair loss.
What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast.
So he starts out recording in the dark with candles, so, you know, maybe that's why he needs to sell overpriced supplements, since he can't afford the electric bill.
Part of the reason, a huge part of the reason that I'm here is this is sort of my version of, quote, the remembering, trying to live in the most evolutionarily, ancestrally consistent way possible.
So obviously, that is why it looks like he's living in a cave. You see, he's trying to live like our ancestors, which is why he's on the internet and using a computer while hosting a podcast.
And as you guys all know, a huge part of that for me is getting organs in my diet. We released a product at Heart and Soil, Skin, Hair, and Nails a few months ago, and I got tons of questions. Will this product help with hair loss? And as you'll hear in this podcast, I absolutely think it will.
So after spending 10 minutes or so mumbling about his ancestors, he finally brings up his supplement, and he claims without a shadow of a doubt that this supplement will absolutely help with hair loss, and he has Rob English about to come on to prove it. So let's hear what they have to say.
And I think that you have a story. I mean, maybe we can just start with your Hair Club for Men story.
Nah, that's all right. I mean, I'm sure you're a fine lad, but I don't think we need to hear your story, so let's move on. Whoa, hold on a minute. Maybe I'd actually better go ahead and check on this whole Rob English story, because it sounds a little too good to be true, almost like you're a bald guy and you get a response on a dating website. I mean, here he is not taking finasteride or minoxidil, but instead, as we'll soon see, he's using a bunch of new age alternative medicine woo hair treatments, but his hair still looks really good. So what did it look like before he started treatment? Well, going to his website, perfecthairhealth.com, you read about him. At 17 years of age, he went to a hair transplant doctor with his mother, and the doctor did say he had some hair thinning, though his hairline was intact. So he got a prescription for minoxidil and Propecia, but like he says on the video, he ended up throwing the finasteride out since he was worried about possible side effects, and instead opted to find his own solution, as if that has ever worked before. It makes me wonder if he's ever tried onion juice and broccoli. So let's take a look at his before and after pictures. Well, first we have his 2005 pre-hair loss picture, and we see what just looks like to me to be a hair whorl. Next, we fast forward to 2011, showing two similar pictures, which again just seem to show what looks like a hair whorl to me. This was after 4 years of minoxidil, and his hair actually looks fine, though we don't have any pictures of his hairline in front. So next, a year later, it looks like he's wearing a Santa outfit, and we catch a glimpse again of what just looks like a hair whorl. He looks like he has a ton of hair, frankly, particularly in the front, but we can't see his hairline, and maybe this is just some comb-over effect, who knows? He is still on minoxidil, but he quit it right after this picture, so maybe the next picture will look different. So this next picture is from 2014, at least a year after quitting minoxidil, and again, we just see his hair whorl, no sign of balding at all, and no picture of his hairline. Same thing again in 2016, and in the present video he has on his website, it looks like his hair is drooping over his eyebrows, but I have to question, did he have any significant androgenetic alopecia to begin with? I mean, I'm not convinced by any of his photos. I mean, everyone has a patch of absent scalp hair at the site of the hair whorl. Even prepubescent children have a hair whorl. In fact, using the mathematical discipline known as topology, it is mathematically impossible to have a hairy sphere without a hair whorl and a small space not covered by hair. It's where your cowlick comes from. So I think I discovered what Rob English's secret to solving hair loss is. It's not having androgenetic alopecia to begin with. So I'm not impressed by Rob English's hair loss study at all, but he does have a few publications and he is a medical editor, so I know he at least is a little bit smarter than HairGuard. So I was wondering, what's in it for him to be going around promoting things like scalp massages and blood flow theory on sites like Dr. Saladino's podcast? Well, a little more investigation and we get to the bottom of it all. Well, for only $147 every 6 months, you get a book he wrote, so I guess you get a copy of the same book every 6 months. You get 130 plus regrowth regimens, 50 plus case studies, 30 plus guides and interviews, and access to a community forum that is probably going to have a thread talking about how awful I am after I publish this video. But you know, if you want to go to a forum where they just talk about hair loss bro science, you just go to the Ray Pete forums for free. But if that's not enough, for just $297 every 6 months, you get all that in a video call with Rob English once a week, and you can ask him anything. So while Dr. Saladino is selling expensive supplements, Rob English is just selling himself. And actually, it looks like Dr. Saladino has the better deal, because at least you get some nutrients, or as Sverige would say, nutrients, in the organ supplements that he sells. Probably cheaper and not as cruel to just get it from plants, though. Anyways, let's go ahead and get back to the video.
When I had this appointment, the dermatologist basically specified that I can start to use a topical application called Minoxidil, which basically improves vasodilation. It has some prostaglandin modulating activity, but there's still a lot of uncertainty to exactly how that works. And that the outcomes for that would be that I might be able to slow this process down, maybe temporarily see a little bit of hair regrowth. And then the other options were more pharmaceutical in nature in terms of reducing a typical hormone that is associated with the progression of male pattern hair loss. And that's the drug Finasteride, which is a DHT reducer.
So far, he sounds pretty reasonable. In fact, I was downright impressed he didn't try to play the whole minoxidil works by improving Blüdflow to the scalp gimmick, which is a common talking point amongst hairline fraud cells and snake oil salesmen. What he said about minoxidil's mechanism of action not being fully understood is true. There are several theories as to how it works, but we don't know for certain what makes it work. But we do know it isn't because of vasodilation, otherwise every blood pressure medication would promote hair growth. And he's also correct in his assessment of the mechanism behind finasteride, so we know he at least hasn't gone down the whole Ray Pete, Danny Roddy rabbit hole of alternative medicine bro science quackery. So props so far, my friend. Please continue.
So testosterone has this metabolite called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. And DHT has a very strong relationship with male pattern hair loss. In fact, when you rewind to research from the 1940s, Hamilton, this doctor, observed in male castrates that men who were castrated before puberty, whereby they'd see a 95% reduction in testosterone and presumably DHT levels as a consequence, since DHT is a metabolite of testosterone, those men were protected from developing male pattern hair loss later on in life.
As you suggested, there is this conversion between testosterone and dihydrotestosterone mediated by this enzyme 5-alpha reductase. And this is also a series of hormones that are important for prostatic hypertrophy.
Yeah, how can we live without prostatic hypertrophy? Who doesn't want to make taking a piss feel like maxing out a barbell squat?
And these drugs, finasteride and dutasteride or dutasteride, whatever you want to pronounce it.
Now would be a good time to remind you guys that Paul Saladino is a medical doctor.
What is your sense of that? Do you think DHT is really just like a redundant hormone? Is there really not any evidence that taking finasteride could have negative effects on performance for males especially?
So Paul Saladino brought up his concerns with suppressing DHT by bringing up typical misconceptions about the hormone, such as saying that DHT might be necessary for male performance and virility. And after this, the whole podcast could have really gone off the whole post-finasteride syndrome deep end. But thankfully, Rob English lays to rest this concern, as we'll see here.
DHT is a pretty important hormone. It has neurosteroid properties. It has developmental properties. But in adulthood, it seems like that hormone, at least with the evidence so far, is less necessary.
Rob English also does a good job of debunking other misconceptions about finasteride, such as bringing up how the original finasteride research showed only a 0.5% difference in the incidence of side effects in finasteride users versus placebo. And these were during the clinical trials where they had thousands of subjects, so it doesn't get much more valid than that. He also brings up that there is a big psychosomatic component to the side effects of finasteride, where subjects who were informed about finasteride's side effect risk were much more likely to have them than people who were told that they don't have side effects. So all of this is very reasonable, and Rob English leaves a very good first impression. Sadly, though, it's all downhill from here.
When I first started with the carnivore diet, I was very interested in fish eggs, in salmon roe. And then one of my friends said, hey, those have astaxanthin, and that inhibits DHT, or at least the formation of DHT. And I thought, oh man.
Now Paul Saladino starts talking about salmon roe, which contains astaxanthin, which is a weak 5-AR inhibitor, and therefore might reduce DHT levels. So, okay, this is pretty interesting, and maybe here at last we are going to finally start talking about food and hair loss, but this turns out to be a very missed opportunity, because instead of following up on the possibility that salmon roe might affect angiogenic alopecia, he immediately turns to talking about how he became hesitant to eat salmon roe because it might lower his DHT and affect his strength gains. And then he says he worries about young people eating salmon roe because of its DHT effects, despite the fact that fish eggs are staple foods for many cultures like the Japanese, the Swedes, and also the Inuits. Don't get me wrong, eating fish eggs is absolutely fucking disgusting, but if they could inhibit DHT enough to the point that it will have any chance on maybe affecting our physiology or delaying puberty, I think we know by now, since fish eggs have been consumed for centuries, if not for millennia.
I'm glad that we were able to discuss the mainstream therapy, but I think the majority of the focus of this podcast is going to be on other things that we can do and how we can think about male pattern hair loss, even without medications. And so I don't want anyone listening to this thinking that this is just about medications.
Of course Paul Saladino doesn't want to talk about real treatments for hair loss like finasteride. He's got some bullshit supplements to sell. Rob English was starting to make enough sense about finasteride here that I was worried I'd end up agreeing with him on everything and have to stop this video prematurely. But fortunately, now we're going to get into the part where he stops making sense and dives real deep into the whole Ray Pete forum style bro science part of the podcast. But before that, Dr. Saladino asks him a question about other causes of alopecia. So Rob English then goes into different causes of hair loss besides angiogenic alopecia, like telogen effluvium and alopecia areata, but there's nothing new or controversial about what he's saying on this, so let's go ahead and move on.
And why this is so interesting is because there is a ton of evidence coming out that in the westernized world, the incidence of pattern hair loss is increasing and its age of onset is accelerating. And you think about the types of stress that people are under on a regular basis, sleep quality, working hours, diet, the processed foods, the sugars, the nutrient deficiencies, the number of Americans that have a vitamin D deficiency that corresponds with telogen effluvium-based shedding. And then you look at how many people are balding today relative to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The survey-based evidence out of China, which has been rapidly westernizing, is that in 2010, 2.9% of men aged 18 to 29 were facing pattern hair loss at a cosmetic level. Now, survey data suggests that 60% of Chinese or China-based university students notice visible hair loss.
So in this part of the video, Rob English is saying that the incidence of androgenic alopecia has increased incredibly in just the last 10 to 20 years, and he blames it all on the stress of modern life and the Western diet. He says that surveys in China show that the incidence of male pattern baldness has gone from 2.9% to a whopping 60% in just 10 years. These numbers are hard to believe, especially that the incidence of androgenic alopecia was only 2.9% in China 10 years ago. And yes, I know that Asian cultures don't have as high of an incidence of androgenic alopecia compared to Caucasian cultures, but come on, the difference can't be that great, and it doesn't seem possible that it would go up 20-fold in just one decade. So just on the face of this, there's something clearly wrong with this data he's citing. Logically speaking, it just can't be true, and he doesn't bother substantiating it anyway. He just says, survey says. Anyways, he feels that this dramatic change in hair loss incidence is due to stress causing telogen effluvium in people, which is shortening the hair growth cycle, and that shedding from stress is accelerating androgenic alopecia because the hair is growing back miniaturized. Now, telogen effluvium is the second most common cause of hair loss, albeit a distant second, but is defined as a temporary loss of hair due to extreme stress, such as the loss of a loved one or trauma due to surgery or injuries. Rob English is claiming that there is a form of telogen effluvium that just happens all the time due to the usual stress of modern day life. This is an extremely outlandish claim. If we wanted to verify something like this, we'd have to see statistics that show the rate of hair loss in Amazon warehouse employees, for instance, who work under extremely stressful circumstances, compared to, say, employees who work at Google, who are reportedly pretty pampered compared to most professions. I mean, this telogen effluvium theory is just speculation, and he doesn't present any evidence to prove it whatsoever. Nobody denies that extreme stress can be a factor in hair loss, but that is not the same thing as androgenic alopecia. Androgenic alopecia is going to progress regardless of your stress levels because it is androgens on the scalp that cause it. Telogen effluvium is a separate process which is a lot less common and certainly isn't present in everyone who has androgenic alopecia.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the problem right now that consumers face is that they don't get that education at an online level. They don't get that education at the doctor's office because that doctor has 7 minutes with you and therefore can only look at your hair loss and say, it looks like pattern hair loss. Here's a prescription for finasteride. Start taking minoxidil. Consider a hair transplant.
So here, Rob English brings up the common misconception that doctors are always rushed and they don't have time to really evaluate you thoroughly or properly educate you, and instead, to make it easy for them, they will just go ahead and slap you on finasteride minoxidil if you have male pattern hair loss. The fact, though, is that doctors do know what they're talking about, and being that Paul Saladino is a medical doctor himself, I am surprised he let Rob English get away with this bullshit claim. Though maybe as a supplement salesman, he never sees patients anymore and doesn't know what it is like to see patients, but who knows. Fact of the matter, though, is that the reason doctors usually end up prescribing drugs like finasteride minoxidil is because those are the treatments that have the most clinical evidence for their safety and efficacy, and also because the vast majority of people seeking treatment for hair loss indeed do have androgenic alopecia. The rare causes of hair loss he's talking about, like stress, hypothyroidism, and malnutrition, account for a very small number of hair loss cases, and they are easily distinguishable from male pattern baldness. Doctors are not stupid. If your cause of hair loss is due to something other than androgenic alopecia, they will be able to properly diagnose that and treat you accordingly. Fact is, though, if you are losing your hair, there is a very strong likelihood that the cause is androgenic alopecia, and the doctors will prescribe finasteride because that is what works. Not Oregon supplements, scalp massages, or hair bands. That is what Dr. Google thinks treat hair loss, not real doctors.
but a growing number of people are non-responders to this drug, at least anecdotally, and from my experience tracking people over a number of years. And it's because nobody takes the time to address that other side of the equation.
Remember what I said about things going downhill? Well, this is what I was talking about, chooms. There is no evidence to support this claim that the number of people responding to finasteride has gone down. The fact is, the majority of people who take finasteride successfully don't talk about it, because why would they? They just take the drug and they get on with their lives, and who could blame them? The reason why it may seem like so many people are non-responders is for several reasons. First, most people have simply not been on the drug long enough, and they'll misinterpret a shed as a sign that the drug isn't working. Remember, it can take up to 2 years to see the full benefits of finasteride, yet there are a lot of people who get anxiety because they're not seeing results after 3 months or even just a few days in some extreme cases. Secondly, people who don't get the results they expected to get from finasteride or are imagining side effects are much more likely to talk about it online compared to people who have a good response to it. I mean, after all, you don't see forums of people dedicated to talking about how great Pepto-Bismol was for them, because usually when something works, people just accept the benefits and move on with their lives. Finally, the fact that there is so much more social media now compared to when finasteride was first released in 1992 is another huge factor, since now every idiot has a platform to spread as much fear and misinformation about this drug as they want. Back in the day, if you didn't respond well to a drug, you just talk to your doctor and they'd work out another treatment plan, such as a dose titration, rather than go to some forum and bitch about how finasteride gave you an inverted penis and made your anus numb or made you transgendered or something.
Now, interestingly, this same friend who hit his head and had trauma-related apparent telogen effluvium also tried a vegan diet. And the reason that he stopped doing a vegan diet was twofold. The first was that he noticed that his hair was coming out in clumps in the shower, that he was actually shedding hair in the shower, which was probably some combination. Again, this is an anecdote, this is an N of one, but anyone that's listened to this podcast for any amount of time will know that I have major concerns about plant-based diets long-term and nutrient deficiencies.
So I knew it was only a matter of time before Dr. Saladino decided to be a pushy troll fuck and attack vegans. And he does so by telling an anecdote about a vegan who was losing hair until he switched to an animal-based diet. Now, he acknowledges this as anecdotal, which seems to be pretty par for course for both him and Rob English, because they don't have the scientific data to back up their claims. But while we're on the subject of anecdotes, it's funny how many carnivore diet promoting figures on social media seem to be bald themselves. Examples: Bobby's Perspective, bald. Primal Hedge Health, bald. Bart K, bald. And I also know a lot of vegan social media figures who have full heads of hair. Examples: Red Pill Vegan, Norwood One. Brian Turner, full head of hair. Corey McCarthy, again, full head of hair. So there you go. Those are my vegan anecdotes to counter your carnivore anecdotes. So checkmate, carnivore dieters.
Now he eats an animal-based diet, which is amazing. And incidentally, the second reason was that his wife told him that he was getting too emotional and he was eating too many soybeans and too many estrogens, and she wanted him to stop eating a vegan diet so he would be more emotionally stable. Again, just a comical anecdote. Who knows if that's actually what was going on?
Now, I know the whole soy equals estrogen is a common meme for people who want to troll vegans, but remember, you don't need to even eat soybeans if you are vegan. Soybeans are a common allergen after all, and it's not like people who are allergic to soybeans can't go vegan. And even if you are eating soy, the data suggests, and I'll link a study below, that eating soybeans does not have any significant effect on plasma hormones or semen quality. And I know soy has become a meme for basement-dwelling, alt-right, neck-bearded trolls, but can we please try to keep the discussion serious and focus on legitimate science? Thank you.
There are some who are eating plant-based diets who do appear to be less emotionally jubilant.
Jubilant? Does anyone know what the fuck that word means?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's certain advantages and disadvantages of basically any diet that you want to try. For me personally, I've tried all of them, because when I was in that period where I was looking for a solution outside of the drug model, I tried vegetarianism, veganism, paleo, low-carb paleo, ketogenic dieting. I tried the Gerson therapy juicing cleanse. I tried fasting. And I never really saw any of these diets move the needle for me in terms of hair loss.
So Rob English now says that he's tried many different diets and that none of them ever affected his hair, and this is probably not something Dr. Saladino wants to hear since he's clearly into the whole improve your diet to stop hair loss mindset, but he didn't mention the carnivore diet specifically yet, but he'll get into that later in the video, so let's wait and see.
Hair shedding. And what drives hair shedding? Really dumb decisions dietarily, environmentally, lifestyle-wise, the absence of treatment for chronic conditions, all of the things that we've discussed. So everybody's got the ingredients for pattern hair loss, more or less, but not everybody lives in such a way that's going to accelerate its onset.
So despite having just said that he's tried lots of different diets and that none of them improved his hair, he's now claiming that bad diet decisions as well as bad environment can cause hair shedding, and that's what triggers androgenic alopecia. He even goes so far as to say that everyone has the potential to have pattern hair loss, which is androgenic alopecia. The one thing he doesn't mention in his list of causative factors is the one thing that really does matter, and that is genetics. If lifestyle were so important, then why do some homeless people and drug addicts have full heads of hair? The reason why is because not everyone has the genetic propensity to have androgenic alopecia. Rob English is saying this like he's the first person to try to say something like this, but he's not. This is a common misconception that hair loss is intrinsically linked to lifestyle, and frankly, it's insulting because he's implying that people with male pattern baldness have it because it's their own fault due to their lifestyle decisions. It's unfair enough that we have to deal with this damn curse, and the last thing hair loss sufferers need is for people to think we're going bald because we make poor lifestyle decisions.
And that's why a lot of people can make it to 60, 70, 80 years old without any signs of pattern hair loss at all. I mean, look at David Mamet or Willem Dafoe. These guys have incredible hairlines and they're old, and doesn't seem like they're really losing a lot of hair.
Bullshit. So now he's bringing up celebrities who are old yet have incredible hairlines. It's probably because they don't have the genetics for androgenic alopecia. It's not their diets or their levels of stress. Also, even though these are public figures, you don't know everything they do in their personal lives. For all you know, they could very well be using finasteride and minoxidil and they just don't disclose it. Regardless of why they still have full heads of hair at their age, the fact is that genetics is the main predictor of androgenic alopecia. In fact, over 250 genes have been discovered to be associated with androgenic alopecia, and I'll link that study below in case you're not convinced that genetics are in fact the biggest contributing factor in androgenic alopecia.
Yeah, I really appreciate these comments about diet. It's interesting that you've tried so many of them. I certainly have my bias. Anyone listening to this podcast will know that I think a really great way for humans to get lots of nutrients is to eat organs, which is why we do what we do at Heart and Soil. I've certainly heard many anecdotes, and we'll get into this. I know you've got a bunch of slides from people who have done a carnivore diet or an animal-based diet, that their hair seems to get a little bit better. I don't want to overstate these claims or, make it sound like it's going to regrow all your hair or you're going to be, like you're going to have amazing afro after this. But there is something here, and diet certainly makes a difference, as we're talking about with this telogen effluvium and this nutrient deficiency. And I think a great way to get nutrient deficiency, as you suggest, is to not include many animal foods in your diet, and that could accelerate the process. And I think, as we've talked about, and I've talked about multiple times on this podcast, anytime we're doing a quote restricted diet, we need to be aware of the fact that this could lead to nutrient deficiencies, which is what's so interesting to me about eating animal-based, because though the mainstream might consider it restrictive because there are no vegetables, I'm not convinced there are any nutrient deficiencies here. And from my perspective, it's even a net positive because you're eliminating so many of the anti-nutrients that are going to interfere with overall nutrient absorption.
He claims that the carnivore diet is not restrictive. Yeah, not restrictive other than the fact that you have to eliminate everything from your diet except for meat, basically. And he also says that eliminating plant foods from your diet is good because it gets rid of the anti-nutrients. Well, what he doesn't mention is that first, most anti-nutrients are already destroyed through preparation, and there's no evidence that they are harmful in the low levels that exist in the diet. Secondly, some of these so-called anti-nutrients also have known beneficial effects. For example, tannins, I should say, which can interfere with iron and protein absorption, have been shown to lower the risk of heart disease and diabetes due to their antioxidant properties. Third, he's ignoring all the adverse health effects of eating meat, especially since he's a big promoter of red meat, which is responsible for the development of colon cancer and heart disease. I will link a good review of these so-called anti-nutrients below, but the bottom line is that the risk of these substances is totally overhyped and overblown by the carnivore/paleo/keto fans. Grow up and eat eat your goddamn vegetables. Vegetables are good for you, and your ancestors didn't know anything about good nutrition. They just ate what they had to in order to survive, and they were ancient if they made it to the age of 40. Very few organisms that exist on the planet are perfectly adapted to their environment, and humans are no exception. So let's stop using appeal to nature fallacies to define what constitutes a healthy diet.
Obviously, eat a nutrient-rich diet.
After Rob English made a big point about how no diet he ever tried has affected his hair, Dr. Saladino goes on to say that obviously you have to eat a nutrient-rich diet. So what's the message they're trying to send here? Does diet matter or does it not matter? Then again, why is Rob English even bother trying to save his hair? He doesn't have Angiogenic alopecia, so he could be eating Cheetos and Mountain Dew for all we know and still be a Norwood 1.
Well, we know that almost everybody has pattern hair loss.
So again, he claims almost everybody has pattern hair loss, and only smart people like he and Paul Saladino have figured out that you can avoid it by reducing stress, killing animals, or by changing your gut microbiome, or by massaging your scalp, and that's just mentioning some of the spaghetti they throw against the wall during this podcast. I mean, even if this did work, which it doesn't, why radically change everything in your life just to avoid popping a pill every day, or even every other day to stop hair loss? Especially since even Rob English himself correctly stated that the side effect profile of Finasteride is overblown.
It's this hormone that's paradoxical. It causes hair loss in the scalp, but then it grows hair in the beard, it grows hair in the chest, and in other parts of the body.
Okay, so he's getting into the so-called androgen paradox by asking why does DHT stimulate body and beard hair growth while at the same time causing hair loss on the scalp, and he's going to use this to segue into his big reveal, which is that he believes in the Blüdflow theory.
So, interestingly enough, when you talk to dermatologists about pattern hair loss, if they're very familiar with examining people's scalps, almost all of them will say that 80% of the individuals who they examine, those individuals with AGA will have really, really tight scalps.
Ah, crap, I knew it. We're getting into the whole tight scalp thing again with the Gallia and Aponeurotica supposedly limiting blood flow by causing scalp tension, blah, 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 blah. This is really disappointing because I thought my previous videos on the subject laid this stupid theory to rest. I mean, even HairGuard hasn't created any new videos defending the blood flow theory, especially after I absolutely mogged the bleeding crap out of his worthless grow band, but somehow this stupid theory refuses to die, and yes, I do blame you for this, Rob English, so please, dude, stop trying to make the Blüdflow theory a serious subject. It is, always has been, and always will be a scam marketing gimmick to sell worthless products and programs.
It demonstrated that injecting Botox across the scalp perimeter led to injecting Botox across the scalp perimeter over a 10-month period, 2 rounds of injections for patients with angiogenic alopecia, led to a 75% response rate, meaning that 75% of individuals saw some degree of hair regrowth. And the average amount of hair regrowth seen across responders and non-responders combined, 18%.
So now he's bringing up the Botox studies, which I covered in my last video. The bottom line with Botox, though, is that there is some evidence that Botox may have a mild effect on hair growth, but not through relaxing muscles. Rather, what causes it is through the decreasing of negative growth factors like TGF-beta-1. So this Botox data is not the supposed proof of the scalp tension theory that everyone, including Rob English, thinks and wishes it were. After all, if blood flow were the reason Botox promoted hair growth, then why wouldn't other things that improve blood flow promoted, such as blood pressure medication or cardiovascular exercise? I mean, why is it that you think that Botox's mechanism of action is more likely to be because it relaxes the muscles rather than its suppression of negative growth factors, which has been documented and verified in scientific research? I already discussed all of this in my previous video on the subject, which I'll link below, but I think the real reason you want to downplay the significance of TGF-beta-1 and instead fixate on this whole blood flow thing and scalp tension muscle relaxation thing is because you want to sell programs based around the same premise. I don't blame you for wanting to make money, man, but we're talking about people's hair here. Stop giving them false hope by pretending that there is some sort of natural alternative to finasteride. There simply isn't.
So I looked into studies related to microneedling, and I saw that you could actually, through microneedling, improve scar tissue outcomes in the scalp.
So So sort of as an aside, he brings up microneedling as a hair loss treatment, and he says it works by causing inflammation, which supposedly improves hair growth through the promotion of growth factors. But we know inflammation is a process that leads to fibrosis, and the studies he quotes looks at microneedling plus minoxidil rather than just microneedling alone. If microneedling does anything, it may just increase absorption of minoxidil into the skin, but I go into detail on that in my video on microneedling, which I'll link below. But the bottom line is that there isn't enough evidence to suggest that microneedling by itself is a useful standalone treatment for hair loss. Anyways, he only spends a few moments talking about microneedling, so let's not waste time on this subject and rather just move on to what he really wants to promote, which of course are scalp massages.
And for what worked for me, it sounds really stupid, sounds really simple, but it was scalp massages. It was massaging the perimeter of my scalp with my fingertips.
Here he claims that scalp massages miraculously cured his hair loss. No, it didn't, Mr. English. You never had hair loss to begin with. How can you cure a condition you don't have? Well, the big study that every hairline fraud cell likes to quote on scalp massages is actually by Rob English himself, and we'll get into it when he gets into it, which is coming up soon.
Well, when these scalp muscles contract, they reduce blood flow to the top of the scalp because they pinch off the carotid arterial, the subarterial artery bands that then indirectly supply the top of the blood to the scalp. There was a study by Goldman in 1996 that demonstrated that transcutaneous oxygen levels to balding regions were 40% lower than non-balding controls.
Now he's directly talking about the Blüdflow theory and oxygen levels. The theory being that at high oxygen levels, testosterone is converted into estradiol, but at low oxygen levels, it is converted into dihydrotestosterone. He brings up the Goldman study that showed lower oxygen levels in the scalp of bald men. Now, this study was published way back in 1992 and found lower oxygen levels in the scalps of bald men versus men with hair. And Goldman proposed that bald men have lower blood flow to the scalp, and this causes more conversion of testosterone into DHT, and so therefore they lose their hair. The problem with this study, though, is that Goldman didn't bother to consider the more obvious explanation, and that's the fact that the loss of hair follicles from DHT reduces the capillary beds in the scalp, and therefore the blood flow is lower because there is less need for a blood supply to a bald scalp. In other words, the reduced blood flow and oxygen levels are the result, not the cause of balding. This whole Blüdflow theory has been debunked, and I'll post a video below which goes into more detail, but without even looking at the research, you can just use intuition alone to see how flawed this concept is. I mean, if scalp tension is the cause of hair loss, why do some people have androgenic alopecia in different patterns, such as with the case of diffuse thinners, or even in the case of retrograde alopecia, where people lose hair at the sides of the scalp first, where tension is supposedly the lowest? Why do hair transplants work after all? I mean, even way back in 1959, this theory was completely debunked when a doctor named Dr. Orentreich demonstrated that hair sensitive to androgenic alopecia, when it was transplanted to other areas of the body, would still miniaturize at the same rate. This debate was resolved decades ago, yet thanks to people like Rob English and HairGuard, we still haven't been able to put this stupid theory to rest.
We've published a peer-reviewed study in a dermatology journal about these massage techniques. It was survey-based, so it's not the highest quality, but it is something.
In here, Rob English briefly talks about the study that he published on scalp massages. He recruited the subjects from people who had already signed up on his own website, perfecthairhealth.com, and these were people who he described as self-assessed androgenic alopecia sufferers, which if you include Rob English as one of them, could mean just about any level of androgenic alopecia, including not having any androgenic alopecia at all. He then sent out surveys after they viewed a video on his site about how to massage the scalp, and 18% of the subjects, which was 340 subjects, completed the survey. Of these, 69% reported stabilization or regrowth of their hair after daily scalp massages. So the bottom line is we have a group of self-diagnosed subjects who supposedly have androgenic alopecia who may have never been diagnosed by an actual physician and instead are just members of the Rob English Perfect Hair Health cult who are seeking alternative hair therapies, so probably a weird bunch of people to begin with. Anyway, some of them reported that they got some improvements with scalp massages, but of course, as usual with these kind of studies, there was no control group and there were no objective findings like with the phototrichogram. Not only that, the main author of the study, Rob English, is clearly biased since he is selling scalp massage videos on his website, so he is definitely not a neutral researcher in this study. Well, at least though he admits on this podcast that the survey study on scalp massages was not the highest quality study, but I should remind you guys that he's trying to sell a program based on the study, which he just admitted is deeply flawed. That would be like if I were to take some obscure study on broccoli and sulforaphane and use it to create a Kickstarter to fund a product with no promise that it will work, but then assure everybody that the money you give me will be used to research whether or not it works later on. But let's move on from that.
Minoxidil was a fourth-line treatment for resistant secondary hypertension, and minoxidil is a very potent vasodilator. So wouldn't it make sense with all of these other mechanisms that something that vasodilates the blood supply of the scalp could improve hair regrowth?
Now, there are a lot of theories about how minoxidil works, but vasodilation is not one of them. In fact, Rob English already discussed this earlier in the video, saying that vasodilation is not how minoxidil works, but he fails to call out Dr. Saladino here and just lets this inaccurate statement go completely unchallenged. So, maybe he has a crush on Paul Saladino or something, or more likely, he doesn't want to upset Paul Saladino since he's using his bigger platform to promote his own hair loss program.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's actually a lot of debate between doctors and dermatologists as to whether or not blood flow is a cause or consequence. Reduced blood flow is a cause or a consequence of pattern hair loss.
The other doctors are right. It's Rob who is wrong. Reduced Blüdflow is a consequence, not a cause of angiogenic alopecia. Like I already said, it is a consequence of scarring since you lose capillaries when you go bald. Your hair follicles are individual organs, and each one has its own capillary bed, and DHT is a trigger which sets off a series of physiological steps that results in reduced microvascularization of the hair follicles, which eventually leads to their destruction. No amount of blood flow through muscle relaxation will change this.
The fact that this is still debated as absolutist opinion by people on YouTube and online, it's really annoying because it just kind of spreads misinformation. There is no consensus.
Gee, I wonder who he is talking about there. Wait a minute, isn't Paul Saladino's podcast also on YouTube? So why is it bad that I debate this stuff on YouTube, but it's okay for you to push your Blüdflow theory on the same platform? I do agree, though, that you are spreading misinformation, and it is very annoying that this debunked theory is still being treated seriously by anyone.
Science that are promulgated as fact. LDL causes heart disease, fiber is necessary to poop, and the best things since unicorn farts, that are not, in my opinion, clear.
So now he's bashing those big, mean medical doctors who think LDL causes heart disease and that fiber is important to poop. This is no surprise since Paul Saladino, like everyone else who promotes the carnivore diet, is a cholesterol and statin denialist. But the fact of the matter is that high serum LDL levels do cause heart disease. This is not even a controversial issue. There are numerous studies involving thousands of patients that have established the link between LDL and the risk of cardiovascular disease. For example, in a study published in 2018, which I'll link below, they looked at 36,375 participants who were followed for an average of 27 years, and increased LDL was associated with a 50% increased risk of death from cardiovascular disease. This is, of course, no surprise. After all, we know that all negative lifestyle behaviors raise LDL, and this would include things like smoking, as well as a sedentary lifestyle, as well as having higher body fat percentage. And conversely, we also know that all positive lifestyle factors like exercise, losing weight, and quitting smoking lower LDL levels. Heart disease is the biggest killer of the human species, and as such, it is the most thoroughly researched pathology on the planet. Its causation and association with high LDL levels is not in the least bit controversial, and there's nothing this Paul Saladino or any other carnivore idiot has discovered which contradicts any of this research on heart disease. Also, fiber is important to poop. Why do you think doctors prescribe things like Metamucil, which is just fiber, to treat constipation? Also, fiber is important for lowering LDL levels, but then again, Paul Saladino will tell you this doesn't matter because he's a cholesterol denialist. For me personally, I'll trust the research involving tens of thousands of patients conducted by the best cardiologist in the world over a former cardiology physician assistant who quit medicine to become a supplement pusher.
We have this tendency within medicine, and then that's translated to the mainstream communication to the public, to over rely on medications and to say, hey, we have a medication, it works reasonably well. We don't need to worry about the mechanism or what's actually going on. We don't actually understand the root cause. And that's something that's always bothered me. So I so appreciate this line of thinking with regard to hair.
We do know the mechanism of finasteride. It isn't some mystery like Saladino is implying. It works by blocking the 5-AR enzyme, which reduces the trashed hormone DHT in our hair follicles as well as our prostate. His alternative theories are the ones that are actually untested and unproven. But of course, he'd rather gaslight about FDA-approved medications like Minoxidil and Finasteride because he'd rather you trust your hair and health to unproven, non-clinically tested supplements rather than a drug like Finasteride, which is approved by the FDA, which is the most rigorous approval process in the world, something which takes several years as well as hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research and testing. Paul Saladino is of the mindset that just because something is natural, that means it's good. Hair loss is natural after all, so if you really want to go the natural route towards fighting hair loss, you might as well just shave it, bro, and not waste your money on worthless supplements or drugs at all. Just buy a razor.
And what's interesting is that people on the carnivore diet tend to report significant improvements to their graying, and also, like you mentioned, significant improvements to their hair loss overall.
Now he's just sucking up to Paul Saladino by claiming the carnivore diet cures graying hair and it can cure hair loss, even though he said earlier that all the diets he tried didn't do anything for his hair. But of course, Rob English isn't a good case study on the matter, since we all know he doesn't actually have androgenic alopecia, but that is just hearsay.
Yeah, sure. And I totally agree with you. I think that people doing the carnivore diet have clearly demonstrated that our understanding of nutrition and nutritional research and recommended daily allowances and intake, it's either wrong or we don't even come close to scratching the surface.
More sucking up and shameless simping. He's basically just throwing out whatever other factors he can to make it sound scientific without any actual scientific basis to what he's saying. Of course, we are talking about the carnivore diet here, which is literally just a troll diet that was invented on 4chan to trigger vegans and environmentalists, so not much to go with in terms of science to begin with.
I will disclaim that I have been doing carnivore for about a month and a half right now.
So it turns out Rob English has been on the carnivore diet for just a month and a half. First 7 days of the carnivore diet, he just ate nothing but ribeye steaks and water, and then he justifies this as somehow being a sufficient diet by talking about how good it made him feel, as if how you feel has any basis in what constitutes good health. Smoking meth will make you feel good, but that doesn't mean it's good for you. Also, running up a hill can make you feel like you want to throw up, but it's actually extremely good for you.
I'm still waiting for my athletic abilities and my endurance to come back. That's the one thing that's lagging right now.
Well, maybe instead of just waiting for your athletic abilities to return, you should just eat a potato and get some damn carbohydrates. You'd have better athletic performance if you stopped getting your nutrition information from trad thoughts like Michaela Peterson. Carbohydrates are the only energy source that can be stored directly into the skeletal muscle tissue as muscle glycogen, so it is more readily available compared to dietary fat or ketones. And there is data that shows that athletes perform worse on ketogenic diets, and Rob English is a good case study on that. Being in ketosis from a pure meat diet isn't a sign of good health. It's just your body entering into a state of using fat as an emergency resource, and fat is not our preferred fuel source. Glucose is, and that is why glucose is the only fuel that can be stored directly into the skeletal muscle as muscle glycogen. The ketogenic diet isn't at all beneficial for athletic performance. So even though there are some potential therapeutic uses for the ketogenic diet, such as in the case of people with epilepsy, the main reason why most people go on the ketogenic diet is to lose weight. But that doesn't mean it's a good or healthy diet. Taking Adderall with energy drinks will make you lose weight too, after all.
But skin quality, cognitive function, memory, sleep quality, I'm a huge fan so far.
Got to get you some organs, my man. How come you're not eating organs?
So with that prefaced, This is the woman who claimed that she had tried a lot of different interventions, both natural and conventional, had no ability to see a stop in her pattern hair loss, but that all of a sudden, after about 6 months on the carnivore diet alongside these scalp massages, she's seeing significant hair improvements and a sharpening of the hairline. I hypothesized that she probably also was dealing with some sort of underlying bout of telogen effluvium, and that was unresolved until she went on a carnivore diet.
So here are pictures of a woman with hair loss from telogen effluvium before and after the carnivore diet, which shows strong discrepancies in lighting. Like his own pictures on his website of his supposed balding, these pictures don't prove anything. Here, I'll even give you an example of a similar before and after picture that uses the same type of deceptive lighting and angling to convince people of some sort of progress when there actually is none.
I went online and I saw that Sean Baker had shared this photo of somebody with very, very clear male pattern hair loss at the crown. You can see in that first photo from January, he's got significant thinning. And I reached out to this person and he told me that he had tried finasteride in the past, but experienced really bad side effects. And so he couldn't take the drug. And he was also a bodybuilder. And he started the carnivore diet. And over a series of months from January to April, he began to see significant hair density improvements.
Then he brings up Sean Baker's example of a guy who apparently reversed his hair loss from the carnivore diet, and that's no surprise since Sean Baker is a guy who thinks anecdotes are more important than actual science. Also, by looking at this picture, it doesn't look like the carnivore diet has done much to reverse Sean Baker's own pattern hair loss. Ouch, it looks like he's pushing a Norwood 4 or even a Norwood 5 here. Definitely not a good look for somebody who's talking about hair loss. We could just as easily jump to the conclusion that this guy, he reversed his hair loss because he flosses his teeth twice a day, or because he uses aspirin. I mean, there's no evidence that can show his diet had anything to do with hair loss. All we see here is a guy whose hair has improved who also happens to be on the carnivore diet. This literally proves nothing. Then he just shows a few other before and after pictures as if they prove anything, which of course they don't. There is no scientific controlled study that shows any effect of the carnivore diet on hair loss, and since the hair goes through growth cycles, it's important to remember that even people who are losing their hair can have months where their hair looks better than it does at other times. That is why in hair loss studies, we often see improvements even in just the placebo control groups. In addition, these photos are shot by amateurs with different lighting conditions, different hair lengths, and different angles. So this metric for assessing progress is completely worthless.
Well, guess what? This was one patient selected to represent results of the best responders out of 1,000 people.
So he is assuming that the researchers here showed the very best example of finasteride's response. That's not necessarily so. Most scientists would show a typical response in their papers. It is the people who rely just on anecdotes like Rob English who select the very best response out of who knows how many people. Also, the finasteride studies include phototrichogram data, which is a lot more objective than just photos Rob English showed since they can measure exact hair count changes on the scalp. None of his anecdotal responders from his website are having phototrichograms, though. I'm completely sure of that. It's also not true that finasteride's efficacy plateaus after 2 years like he claims. A study from Good Korea, which I'll link below, showed that people continue to make gains on finasteride even after 10 years of usage. And this involved over 500 subjects, I should add. So you should definitely check out my video on that if you haven't yet, but let's go ahead and move on.
There was a news channel that did an investigation and special into certain hair loss drugs. And they gave 5 different guys finasteride for the course of the year. And here are the results that they highlighted for their best of the best responder. Now, at first glance, you might look at this photo and think, oh, wow, things look improved. Well, look more closely. Look at the background color on the far right photo. This is shot in a completely darker room with darker lighting to obfuscate the fact that this person has not had much change at all. I mean,
He then brings up a TV show which he says had 5 different people on finasteride, and he shows what he said were not great results. Well, first of all, he doesn't name the TV show, but I do recognize the clip. It is from an NBC documentary from investigative journalist Stone Phillips that did have 5 men, but only 3 of them were on finasteride. What the show was doing was documenting 5 different men using various hair loss treatments, including finasteride, minoxidil, low-level laser light therapy, Viviscal, as well as hair restoration surgery, and the man he showed in the picture was on finasteride and minoxidil. The reason why the treatment didn't work extremely well for this guy is, for one, he's already pretty far gone. It looks like he's about a Norwood 5 here, in fact. And secondly, the man is over 50. And by that age, there isn't much 5A reductase activity on the scalp to begin with, so finasteride is less effective. Nevertheless, he still got some pretty good results, so it shows finasteride is an effective drug even in people who have lost a lot of ground. So this is not a good example as to why we need alternative therapy. All this shows is that it's a good idea to get on finasteride sooner as opposed to later when you've already lost ground and try to do some voodoo witch doctor shit like scalp massages or organ supplements.
But there's no evidence in the clinical literature that a great diet that is nutrient replete, calorie replete, and meets all of your demands for reducing allergens and inflammation, there's no evidence thus far that that will stop or reverse pattern hair loss. At best, it will only slow its progression.
Here, he admits there is no evidence in the literature that a healthy diet will stop or reverse pattern hair loss. But then he says, without any evidence, that it at best will only slow its progression. He should have quit while he was ahead. Probably not as enthusiastic of endorsement of diet for treating hair loss that Paul Saladino would have liked to have heard, but still more generous than what I would have said, because the truth is that a healthy diet will not stop hair loss, and Robert English admitted this earlier when he said he tried various diets and nothing helped his hair. But remember, he doesn't have angiogenic alopecia. He just likes to talk about it a lot for some reason. The important thing to remember, though, is the need to realize that there was a time before finasteride where people had to try things to treat hair loss other than finasteride and other pharmaceuticals since they didn't exist yet. None of them ever worked, though, because if they did work, we wouldn't have ever needed finasteride. Drug companies are not making these drugs to hide the truth of these natural remedies. These drugs, like finasteride and minoxidil, exist because they are all we have, and natural remedies do not work.
How our gut bacteria changes on carnivorism, and how our gut bacteria actually has an influence over DHT.
Here he starts speculating about the role of gut bacteria. He says gut bacteria has an influence on DHT and androgens, and he goes on and on and on about the gut microflora biome.
Off of these bacteria that can potentiate the recirculation of DHT and the worsening of certain.
Even Paul Saladino is getting bored by this rambling bro science bullshit, all the way to the point where it looks like he's doing neck training here. Is Paul Saladino falling asleep here? I don't blame him.
And we know that a huge percentage of people doing carnivore, not all of them, but a huge percentage, report a cessation in pattern hair loss, improvements to hair graying. And these are anecdotes that we should not ignore because this is how science begins.
Well, it sure doesn't seem to be helping these carnivore YouTubers. In fact, if you look at Primal Edge Health's earlier videos back when he was a vegan still, you can see his hair looks better. So his angiogenic alopecia has progressed at a normal rate. But Rob English will probably ignore those anecdotes because they don't fit with his narrative. This is why anecdotes don't belong in a serious scientific discussion.
And it's just very fascinating stuff.
So let's see how Dr. Paul Saladino reacts to this overly verbose diatribe from Rob English.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So I'll offer a few comments here. I actually will offer a different perspective on a few things that you're hypothesizing. I don't completely agree with the line of thinking. So I will say that beta-glucuronidase, high levels of beta-glucuronidase are correlated with something called dysbiosis in the human gut. But I think we must be very careful to conflate this with carbohydrate consumption. And I haven't read this study with the mice, but I'm almost sure that the carbohydrate they're using in the mice is sucrose. So they're not feeding the mice a species-appropriate carbohydrate and seeing, quote, dysbiosis or include glucuronidase. I think the important point to start with is that, yes, beta-glucuronidase being high in the gut, in the stool, and we can look at this with tests like a GI map or whatever, is a marker of dysbiosis in humans. How they got to the dysbiosis is delicate, and I am not convinced that carbohydrates per se do this in humans at all. Because there are plenty of carbohydrate consuming cultures, whether it's Hadza, the Yukon, who don't have dysbiosis, who don't have high levels of beta-glucuronidase on their stool samples. So there's something else going on here. And, broadly speaking, I think you could be pretty safe in saying that it's a Western diet that leads to high levels of beta-glucuronidase. But I think we have to be really careful, again, not to conflate this with carbohydrates in general or all carbohydrates. I'm not a fan of all carbohydrates, but I just don't think, or I really don't believe, that an otherwise healthy human, ancestrally species-appropriate carbohydrates are going to feed the bacteria that are going to make beta-glucuronidase, that are going to increase the levels of this enzyme in the gut. I think that's taking it a step too far, in my opinion.
Uh-oh, poor Rob English is getting absolutely wrecked here. Paul Saladino is making complete sense. He's actually arguing for incorporating some carbohydrates into the diet, so what Rob English considers to be the carnivore diet is not the same thing that Paul Saladino thinks is the carnivore diet. So how can we conclude anything about the carnivore diet's effect on hair loss when nobody can even agree as to what it is exactly? Paul Saladino absolutely tears this kid a new asshole, and all you can do is watch him like a deer in headlights.
So this is an individual who has what's known as diffuse alopecia areata. It's an autoimmune form of hair loss. They also had been dealing with a variety of issues related to gut dysbiosis.
So since Rob English's claims about eliminating all carbohydrates obviously didn't fly very well with Dr. Saladino, he finally brings up a case of alopecia areata where they used a fecal transplant to alter gut microbiome. So if nothing else works, let's just start doing fecal transplants, and this is all appropriate because this whole podcast is frankly a fecal transplant, and even if there is some merit to any of this, he's talking about alopecia areata, which is an autoimmune disease which has nothing at all to do with androgenic alopecia. So Rob is just grasping for straws at this point after being totally humiliated by internet tough guy Dr. Paul Saladino. Well, we're finally getting to the end, and that's good because poor Paul Saladino is barely hanging in there listening to all this drivel, and honestly, I'm barely hanging in there too. So let's please wrap this up before the rapture comes, shall we? These two gonks, what they're doing is that they're both selling stuff, and they like to give the impression that there are somehow a lot of unknown hair loss treatments out there, and that these unproven so-called natural therapies may be better than FDA clinically proven medications. So if you want to, go ahead and order some desiccated Oregons from Dr. Saladino, or sign up for some personalized hair loss instruction from Rob English, and then you'll get to see your bank account dwindle even faster than your hairline. Now, I know that it is inevitable at this point that there will be people who will respond to this video by personally attacking me for being too mean and trying to make it out like I'm not trustworthy, but the truth is, I'm not the one who's trying to sell you something. I'm just trying to analyze the studies here and give you the best information that I possibly can. I make these videos for fun and because I feel that having been in the good fight against hair loss for a while now and having made both good decisions and bad decisions about hair loss, that I've learned that I am in fact in a good position to teach others about what I've learned as well as to avoid some of the mistakes that I have made in my long journey. You may disagree with me, but I have nothing to gain financially from you choosing whether or not to follow my advice, unlike Rob English and Paul Saladino, who do stand to gain financially from you falling for their scams. So between hair loss and diet, I'm not sure which has the most bro science advice online, but when you combine the two subjects in a video like this particular podcast, the bro science bullshit meter goes off on a scale not seen since Gwyneth Paltrow made the Goop Lab. So this was a long one, so kudos if you made it through, and that goes for you too as well, Rob English and Paul Saladino, if you are in fact watching. I appreciate your attention, and nothing personal, I hope. At least now your followers don't have to watch the even longer original podcast video, since I did them a favor of taking it basically through a colander and draining out all the bullshit, so you're welcome for that one.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the opportunity. I mean, we haven't even gotten to the topic of why full hair regrowth is possible and the evidence supporting it. There are some fascinating case reports there, so next time we can talk about
We'll do a part 2. All right, man. Awesome. Love it.
Yeah, don't call me. I'll call you, alright? Thanks. Honey cut his mic. Yeah, I'm sure by the time Paul Saladino gets back to you, Joe Rogan will have returned Dave Rubin's calls.